Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Golden Sovereign Bubber's Tale Part 2. Bubber could not believe his good fortune. He got no work done the remainder of the glorious day of the good King Levius, nor indeed did he accomplish much the following several days that led up to market day in Creekside. He didn't even mind the cold nights spent wrapped in both of his blankets, his stomach growling for want of sustenance. His mind raced with possibilities. He could now buy Farmer Perfidio's prized bull. Prized bull and some cows. He could buy his own land, and perhaps he could even hire a helper or two to work his land and to live in the hovels made from old caravan trailers. He slept often, always attempting to reach his dreams and live again as often as he was able the fabulous visions he had created during the days when he should have been working. The evening prior to market day, Bubber washed his clothes, patches and all, and even scrubbed his face and hair in the little streamlet that ran down to join the creek near the Epidemia's Creekside. By the next morning, market day at last, Bubber had decided that there was little point in working now anyway. After all, he was a royal squire. He was now a man of means, and he would have a lesson beat into anyone who failed to acknowledge that. He determined that if he had enough money remaining after buying all of the items necessary to his plans, that he would buy a new set of clothes. After all, a man of means must appear to be a man of means. How else would anyone take him seriously? Bubber packed away the Golden Sovereign in his all-purpose burlap tow sack. He heaved it onto his shoulder, which greatly strained the weave of the poor old fibers. As he left his hovel, perhaps for the last time, he looked behind once more. Was that the large black cat, standing beside his hovel and staring balefully through the morning mists? Surely not. It was daylight. Even as he watched, the image faded into the spreading light of the sun. He turned back to the trail and shuffled off into the early dawn mist, traveling slightly downhill, his favorite direction since it required the least effort, towards the village of Creekside, there to achieve his fondest dreams. The sun was at his back, and he could smell the sweet fecundity of spring rising from the heating soil. When Bubber arrived in Creekside, he immediately sought out Farmer Perfidio's. He would have done so on any market day, since Farmer Perfidio's was his master and landlord, and would dole out his monthly allotments. On this day, Bubber was determined to assert himself, and to take his rightful place as a landholder and royal squire, a rank even higher than farmer. In the days since good King Levius had visited, Bubber's pride had grown to weigh as much as the gigantic coin in his tow sack. However, as he approached the group of landholders, of which Farmer Perfidio's was the chief, Bubber's old doubts and habits began to resurface. He had been subservient to all of these people his entire life. He had taken abuse at the hands of their hired ruffians and had learned his lesson well. Therefore, when he attempted to speak in the haughty tone he had imagined for the past several days, his mind grew blank, and he merely stood by and gaped. And can you believe that the fool claimed to have seen the children pass by on horseback several days ago? Farmer Perjurius guffawed, and his friends joined him, though it was clear that the comment hadn't been all that funny to many. No one mentioned the children of Ednow lightly. At that point, Farmer Perjurius, who was sycophant in chief to Farmer Perfidio's, noticed Bubber standing, mouth agape, near the group. "So what do you want, Gruber?" he sneered. Grubber was what many of the farmers called people like Bubber who worked the land. "I doubt Farmer Perfidios has cattle work for you. You should be grubbing with your stick rather than listening in on the affairs of your betters." Although Farmer Perjurius said this sternly and with contempt, he only meant it as a mild rebuke. Bubber was well regarded for his ability to work with cattle, though in all other matters he was still a grubbing dirt-scratcher and not very energetic at all. He was normally a properly behaved young man, to which Farmer Perjurius and other farmstead holders meant groveling, subservient, and keeping as much physical distance between himself and his social superiors as possible. Farmer Perfidios finally took note of Bubber. "Well, boy, Farmer Perjurius has spoken to you. You'd best acknowledge him and get on with your answer." Bubber continued to gape for a moment and looked back and forth between the two powerful men. He then had a horrific thought. What if Farmer Perfidios wouldn't sell him the prize bull? He trembled for a moment as the men of power began to show signs that they would soon begin to remind him of the rough lessons of his life. However, Bubber managed to speak, not to Farmer Perjurius, but directly to Farmer Perfidios. I come to speak with you about matters of business, master." He stammered at the unaccustomed subject, but Bubber remembered his manners, for now Farmer Perfidios was still his master. "Business?" Farmer Perfidios exclaimed quietly, genuinely puzzled at such language emerging from the mouths of Bubber the Grubber. Prior to the moment he would have said that, Bubber didn't even have the word business, or its close equivalent, bidness, in his limited vocabulary. "Fine, boy. We can talk business. Friend farmers, I shall see you shortly at Peter's Tavern," Farmer Perfidios proclaimed with a dismissive wave of his hand. The other farmers walked away towards the old building owned by Peter Vius, an old soldier from foreign parts. Some said as far away as Rem or Kurgia, but who even believed that such lands existed anymore? Pete, as he was known in Creekside and the lands thereabouts, had come to Creekside after a big war with some impressive loot. Some said that he'd been a big-time mercenary, others that he was a criminal chieftain who'd fled with the treasure he'd stolen. Pete had invested his loot wisely by building a tavern and hiring locals to work it for him. He married a local girl named Jewel and had fathered a large brood of girls, all of whom now worked for him, with the original locals currently employed elsewhere or not at all. His ale was excellent and quite famous and popular as a trade item among merchants who traveled the lands hereabouts. Bubber was accustomed to seeing people immediately follow Farmer Perfidios's directions, as he indeed did, with an even greater sense of urgency. Perhaps that's why his bull always won the annual prize at the local fair. "Well, boy, speak up. I don't have all day. What's this business you need to discuss? I warn you, you had better not be wasting my time. Time is money, and money is power." Bubber's newfound confidence finally began to assert itself. "Of course he'll sell me the prize bull and some cows, and if not, I'll travel to another village and buy an even better prize bull." That plan was another of the numerous alternate fantasies that had evolved in his mind in the previous few slothful days. Bubber wasn't sure how to proceed, so he just blurted out what was on his mind. This was normally pretty effective, especially among his fellow grubbers, though he had on occasion blurted the wrong thing until others of his class had beaten some caution into him. These days he arranged his thoughts carefully and then blurted, "I want to buy your prize bull and some cows and some land and a proper house and hire some hands and get some new clothes." He wasn't sure what Farmer Perfidios could do about the new clothes, or that he would even care, but when Bubber blurted, he tended to do a pretty thorough job. Farmer Perfidios stood and looked at Bubber as though he hadn't understood a single word. Perhaps he hadn't, since he erupted almost simultaneously from Bubber's rabbit moving jaws. Bubber wasn't known as a rapid speaker, since he wasn't known as a rapid thinker. "What is it you say, boy? You want to buy my prize bull? And what else?" Before Bubber could even begin to form a reply, Farmer Perfidios continued, "And what would a grubby dirt scraper like you use to buy anything? I give you all you need in exchange for the work you provide me, and a poor exchange it is in matters other than cattle droving. How could you possibly obtain money except by thievery, an occupation that would require more thought than which you are capable? What?" At that point, Farmer Perfidios fell silent, and it was his turn to gape. For Bubber, at the question about what he would use to make a purchase, had set down the tow sack and bent forward to remove the Golden Sovereign. Farmer Perfidios had initially taken the move as a gesture of abject submission, of which he approved in his servants. The late morning sun gleamed from the gilded surface and struck Farmer Perfidios in his eyes. The angry outburst at the pain which would normally be his immediate response was crushed by his amazement. Before his mind could even register exactly what he was seeing, he knew the essential fact. It was gold. Is it real?" he stammered, echoing Bubber's exclamation upon first seeing the magnificent coin. He moved towards the piece and tentatively reached for it. It was one of the few times in his life that he had moved tentatively, but he was in awe, driven by an ecstasy born of avarice. Bubber lifted the heavy coin and presented it to Farmer Perfidios for inspection. Farmer Perfidios grabbed the coin with both hands. He pulled it to his chest and gazed at it longingly. It was wide enough to cover both of his hands together. He was known throughout the area as being a miserly man who genuinely loved the look and feel of coinage. But this was beyond even his wildest fantasies. He'd never hoped, never dreamed to hold so much gold at one time, much less all in one coin. This was enough to buy the entire village, everything in it, and all of the surrounding land. The question was, how did Bubber the Grubber get his dirty, spade-like hands on it? Farmer Perfidios thought quickly. Surely he must have stolen it. But from whom? How would the moron even be able to come up with a plan? He's as strong as a bull, but admittedly very honest. Maybe he found it digging in the dirt, though he hardly ever digs hard enough to plant potatoes, much less find treasure. The real question is not how he got it, but how am I to get it? Farmer Perfidios clung to the gold disc as he pondered his next move. He had to have the Golden Sovereign. It would take only a moment to plan a method by which to take it from Bubber. After all, if Bubber had found it or stolen it, then it rightfully belonged to him, since Bubber worked his land and lived on his generous dole. Bubber stood and watched as Farmer Perfidios mulled his options. Bubber never dreamed of interrupting him. In his mind, he considered how Farmer Perfidios must be surprised and how he was probably deciding how to properly address Bubber, who was now a man of means. He had also to consider what he would charge Bubber to set him up in a castle business. While Bubber mulled, he noticed that he had an itch. He didn't want to scratch it in front of Farmer Perfidios. That would be rude. And Farmer Perfidios had once beaten him for scratching in front of his daughter, Sympheria. Now Sympheria was a treasure unto herself, despite carrying some extra pounds and possessing an overlarge nose. As Bubber embarked on one of his fantasies involving Farmer Perfidios' lovely, at least to him, she always smiled at him, daughter, who had occupied much of his fantasizing capacity prior to his meeting with good King Livius. He failed to note that Farmer Perfidious, a more rapid thinker, had arrived at a conclusion. "Bubber, don't make me repeat myself, boy. I asked you where you got this. How did a grubbing fool such as you lay his filthy paws on such a magnificence? Did you steal it? Did you find it on my land? Did you cast some spell or make a deal with dark powers? Tell me now." Bubber gaped in astonishment, an expression at which he had had a great deal of practice of late. He could not follow the rapid-fire questions and started to creep backwards as the physically smaller Farmer Perfidious leaned towards him, all the while screaming accusations. When he received no immediate response, Farmer Perfidious pressed Bubba further. "Boy, if you've made some deal with dark powers, or if you've stolen what is rightfully mine, I'll have you burned at the stake, or hanged for sure. Ha! Maybe both." As he spoke, Farmer Perfidious clutched the Golden Sovereign under one arm and began poking his finger into Bubber's chest, and advanced in the wake of Bubber's now more rapid and stumbling retreat. Farmer Perfidious raised his voice, had begun to attract attention from others. His comrades and cronies had all emerged from Pete's tavern and spoke among themselves, trying to decide on whether to approach the ever more enraged farmer. None of them spoke of rescuing Bubber, only of how or whether they should assist Farmer Perfidious in haranguing and possibly beating his wayward servant. After all, it was market day, and there should be some community entertainment. Finally, Farmer Perjurious noticed the glint from the object that Farmer Perfidious had tightly held against his bosom. It only took a moment to deduce what it was. Gold. Without further thought or comment, he began to approach the confrontation, lured like a moth to the flame. Others in the group and from around the village also saw the glimmer of gold and were drawn towards the master, berating his servant. The golden disc was just too large to hide. Gold was rarely seen at all, and who could resist partaking in a good beating? Bubber, never graceful, took one too many stumbles in his rearward march. His feet slipped in the mud and he fell backwards against the wall of the village well. He stared up at the enraged Farmer Perfidious as cold, muddy water seeped into his pants and made them cling to his backside. Realizing he could no longer retreat, he began to stammer out his explanation. I got it from good King Livius himself." The last words went from stutter to blur and came out, "Good King Livius himself." His follow-up, "He made me a royal squire," was spoken in a murmur. Bubber repeated the words more clearly, but to no greater effect. He did so as Farmer Perfidious continued to accuse him of consorting with witches and thieves and other unsavory characters, no doubt evil denizens from within the thicket. That did it for Bubber. Good King Livius had used one of the woodland trails. How could Farmer Perfidious accuse the king of being evil? After all, he was called Good King Livius, wasn't he? Did Farmer Perfidious think that I'd encountered a demon in the form of the king? He had said something about consorting with demons, hadn't he? Bubber shouted, "Enough!" Being a large fellow, his shout carried. It stopped Farmer Perfidious' stream of accusation. Problem was, Bubber had little material with which to follow his shout. Farmer Perfidious was happy to fill the empty space. "So I've struck a nerve, have I? Been consorting with the minions of the thicket, have you? Perhaps some type of Ifrine has taken possession of you." Ifrine was not a term used lightly or in polite society, at least not in such bucolic locales as Creekside. The crowd, for now it was such, at least for Creekside, gasped and was moved to silence. Farmer Perfidious was startled to notice that so many had gathered and were awaiting his next comment. It was market day, so there were many more locals present than would normally be the case. He was quick to continue. That's it. You've been consorting with minions of the adversary, and they have rewarded you with this gold from the pits of doom. No doubt for fomenting evil in our land. At the mention of gold, all eyes turned towards the Golden Sovereign. This was not what Farmer Perfidios had intended. He needed the faces and eyes to be turned towards Bubber for his hastily formed plan to work. Why, just the other day, Farmer Darius' prize nanny goat dried up and couldn't produce milk. Farmer Perjurius had a carbuncle in the most embarrassing place. At which point Farmer Perjurius gasped and said place, and somehow managed to grimace in pain and blush in embarrassment at the same time. I'll pay back Bubber for that embarrassment. Never mind that Farmer Perfidios had been the only one to betray the confidence. Bubber was the more convenient and safe target. Farmer Perfidios continued, Yes, and Mistress Megwa's 3 children all fell ill last winter. Surely you have brought all this evil upon us. Farmer Perfidios had apparently forgotten to mention that Farmer Darius's prize nanny goat was 13 years old, or that Farmer Perjurius had a history of carbuncles from his poor hygiene habits, or that many people's children had been ill that past winter, and Mistress Megwab's children were all now sound and healthy and as troublesome as ever. Bubber sat up and managed to blurt out his side of the story in his best blurting manner. I received the gold sovereign from the hands of good King Levius himself. He ate with me and slept in my trailer hovel. He made me a royal squire and invited me to come to Magnesium. He said I was more loyal than any subject in the land or any other this side of the big muddy river. Bubber had finally clearly stated his story. Surely now the people would see reason, he assured himself. The silence of the crowd was even more profound than when Farmer Perfidios uttered his cursed word. It was also short at first. People began to titter and giggle and then laugh out loud and then to guffaw. Imagine King Levius the taxer visiting Creekside and spending the night in a hovel made from an old caravan trailer. He was known to be mad, but not even madman would want to spend more of the time than necessary with Bubber. The boy dreamed large and accomplished small, and was at best a poor conversationalist. Besides, he lived in a hovel, built from a Wagian caravan no less. Several members of the crowd began to speak the contemptuous remarks that most of them were thinking. This only redoubled the laughter. Bubba began to despair, and in his despair he began to stutter once more, and all confidence left his voice and manner. But he did visit me. How can you say such disloyal things about such a good king? Why would you? Enough! This time it was Farmer Perjurius who had shouted. Tell us where you got the gold, fool boy. Is there more? Where did you steal it? At this point, Farmer Perjurius began to move towards Bubber, and at the mention of more gold, so did others. None of them noticed that Farmer Perfidios had crept backwards through the laughing crowd, and was no longer in the village square. If such a small, clear space among a mere handful of public buildings could be dignified with the title of village square, he managed to retrieve Bubber's toe sack to cover the glint of gold in the bright sunlight. Soon the crowd had lifted Bubber from his seat by the well wall. Hard hands pushed and poked and prodded at him, even on his wet behind. How embarrassing. Despite his abject fear, he managed to blush and then immediately to pale. Tell us, grubber, from Farmer Darius. Where did you get it, dirt scratcher? From Billy Boo, another hovel-dwelling grubber, as though he didn't scratch dirt himself. What evil have you brought upon us? From Mistress Megawup, and other similar comments from the now seething mass of bodies that surrounded Bubber, shouting imprecations and accusations. Bubber never knew who struck the first blow, nor the many that followed as he covered his face and head with his long arms to absorb as much of the punishment as possible. He had plenty of practice at taking beatings. He possessed a true talent for it. Then he saw above the edge of the crowd the head of a harvesting flail. That was a bit more of a beating than Bubber wanted to take. At the same time there came voices for moderation. After all, Bubber was considered by most to be a fool, but a decent enough fool. The most persuasive voice was that of Farmer Perfidios's daughter, Symphoria, and people stopped to listen for her father's sake. "Please don't hurt him. Father sets great store by his ability with our cattle. After all, he's just a simple boy who loves to dream. There's no evil in him. Perhaps he was seduced by the fair folk, rather than demons. After all, the children are known to distribute fool's gold to the unwary. Father himself spoke of a group of the children. If he was tricked, then he was at worst a fool." Farmer Perjurius would have responded that when Farmer Perfidios mentioned the children, he was repeating the tale of another fool. However, having sensed the shift in mood, he was busy pulling away the harvesting flail he had taken from Billy Boo. Farmer Perjurius was known to follow the mood of the mob very nimbly. There were murmurs of approval, mostly from other grubbers and hovel dwellers, those of similar background and status to Bubber, who had taken their own share of beatings. Besides, Bubber was getting heavy, so the crowd unceremoniously dropped him back into the mud by the well. While it was fun to beat up on a fool, the community was too small and too practical to support the actual murder of one of its own for no better reason than foolishness. The population would have shrunk rapidly had they been so inclined. "So what about it, Grubber?" asked Farmer Perjurius. "Were you set upon by fairies?" Bubber rubbed his now sore head and elbows, then stood and rubbed at his other end, which was also sore and wet with muck. He thought for a moment and decided that perhaps he had been tricked. Surely good King Levius was too grand a personage to have spent the night in his poor hovel. Fair folk did like to play tricks on the unsuspecting. In all of the tales, the fool's gold had evaporated with the dawn light. Still, when he thought of the harvesting flail, I suppose that could be what happened. I do live in the shadow of the thicket, after all. "That's more reasonable now, isn't it?" asked Farmer Perjurius. His mood had apparently shifted dramatically. "Come now, let's have a drink and you can tell us the truthful story." Bubber was too ruffled to notice the uncharacteristic kindness. Farmer Perjurius liked gold as much as anyone, perhaps more than most, though he possessed nowhere near as much lust for the substance, as did Farmer Perfidios. If there was gold to be had, he would have it, even if it meant drinking with the likes of Bubber. Perhaps with enough drink, the idiot would tell the real story. If he'd let the mob have their way, never mind that he'd stoked their ire, then Bubber wouldn't be able to speak at all. Pete was an egalitarian, at least when it came to making a profit, albeit most coppers and a rare quarter of silver, and he allowed all classes into his tavern, at least on market day, so Bubber had been inside the place on more than one occasion. He followed Farmer Perjurius, still rubbing his damaged parts as he passed the last of the crowd. He cast a grateful glance at Symphoria. He wouldn't dare speak to Farmer Perfidios's daughter. That would result in a beating far beyond what he'd just experienced, and might even bring back the harvesting flail. She smiled shyly in return, which only made Bubber blush and look to his toes. It was hard to tell which parts of his face were blushing and which parts were starting to bruise. Within moments, the mob had begun to disperse with a great deal of good cheer for Bubber the Grubber. He'd managed to bring a rare, if brief, time of entertainment to this month's market day. Variations of That boy sure can take a beating, and what was that all about anyway? Something about the children and fool's tales? Fairies were discussed as people went back to their business and other gossip. Folks could tell the story and embellish their own parts in each telling. The primary goal, forgotten since most hadn't laid eyes on it, and the rest felt that there had to have been some mistake in what they thought they'd witnessed. Besides, everyone had agreed it was fool's gold given by a prankful child of Edna, hadn't they? Despite his normal popularity, Farmer Perfidios was not immediately missed. After all, well-known did not mean well-liked. Bubber wasn't accustomed to strong drink, so Farmer Perjurius never got a straight answer from him, and had to go home frustrated. Of course, he tended to be a frustrated personality, so no one noticed. By the time Bubber had reached the bottom of his third tankard, he had invited all of the farmstead holders, a few travelers and merchants, Pete, Jewel, and all of their daughters, and all of his fellow grubbers to share in whatever bounty he could offer, which was none, since he wasn't paying, just as he offered to good King Levius or his fairy phantom image. Everyone was welcome at the table and hearth of Bubber. This created another laugh, since not even other grubbers wanted to visit a hovel made from an old Wogian caravan trailer, and the good cheer at his expense helped to return Bubber to the good graces of his community. He'd taken yet another beating, but it had spared the flail, or worse, and had learned the lesson of keeping his station in life. After an enlightened encounter with Pete, he eventually stumbled home, passed out, and awakened to a blinding headache, numerous bruises and contusions, and an ill-tended garden. So much for easily earned wealth. It was back to grubbing for Bubber, and to an increased satisfaction with his lot, at least for the moment. Now that he had had an adventure, despite the outcome, he had new fodder for his daydreams, and a newfound sense that he could maybe achieve something more. He also had the memory of Sympheria's smile to warm him until summer arrived. So quoth this raven. Oh, such a sad tale. I do love the fairy tales, as you know, and Bear always delivers. I hope you all are having a lovely November. I got a contract for another audiobook, so yay! I promise not to put you guys on the back burner though. I will probably continue to do the live streams until I get caught up on Tuesdays. And, of course, camping on Saturday. Always, always. I say always, always, but we don't have a ton of story left. It's become such a part of my life that it's going to be tragic to let it go. But nevertheless, on we go. Have a marvelous Thursday, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.